Hello, everyone, and welcome to our November 8th Encounter Center presentation. My name is Scott Culpepper, and it's great to be with you virtually, and I also long for the day when we could be face-to-face once again. Today, we've got a topic that I hope will be fascinating for all of you and one with which you are very familiar, the Pilgrims at 400, remembering the Pilgrim experience and reassessing their legacy. 2020 marks the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims' arrival in North America, and originally there were all kinds of events and other types of commemorations scheduled to give us an opportunity to reassess their legacy and look back at this history. Unfortunately, like so many things this year, the pandemic has upended many of those plans, causing some of them to be canceled or postponed. Others were able to be moved online and became virtual events. So I suspect within the next couple of years or so, as hopefully the pandemic wanes, you will be seeing opportunities for us to look back once again at this anniversary and sort of give it its due. But thankfully, this afternoon, for a few moments, we can gather together through the magic of technology and look at the fascinating story of these people and also how it continues to impact us down to the present day. Now, to begin with, these people that we know as the Pilgrims are actually what historians and theologians refer to as English Separatists. And to discover the origins of that term and what exactly it means for the people we're going to be talking about, we have to go back to the early days of the 16th century when the Church of England was formed by the English King Henry VIII. This occurred in the year 1534. Henry had his own reasons for forming the Church of England, but the net result was the creation of a national church which owed its allegiance to the king rather than to the papacy. Under Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, this Church of England was further developed and transformed. When Elizabeth came to power in 1558, her nation had been troubled by religious strife for a couple of decades by then. And she was very much wanting to create a church settlement that would bring her people together and end at least most of the religious conflicts that had been occurring. And so she tasked her advisors to craft a church settlement that retained the Reformed doctrine that had been incorporated into the Church of England, while also retaining some Catholic ceremony and ritual, as well as the Catholic leadership structure for the Church of England. The Roman Catholic Church had a leadership structure that was guided by bishops and archbishops, what is often referred to as an episcopal structure. Elizabeth retained this structure in her Church of England settlement, so that the Church of England, in its 39 articles, established a church that had many aspects of Reformed Protestant doctrine, but at the same time included ceremonies, clerical vestments, and a leadership structure that was acceptable to many moderate Catholics. This settlement, for the most part, accomplished what Elizabeth intended. It brought together those in the middle on both the Protestant and the Catholic wings of the religious conflicts that had been occurring. But the most committed Catholics and many of the most committed Protestants resisted this Elizabethan settlement. On the Protestant side, many of those who objected were people who had been influenced by the Reformed theology stemming from the work of John Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland. Some of them had even been to Geneva and studied with Calvin. They insisted that a true church structure, one that was based on New Testament readings, was one that was based more on a Presbyterian model, with pastors, teaching elders, ruling elders, and deacons at the head of ecclesiastical structures. Though they heard these petitioners, Elizabeth's counselors rejected their petitions and even derisively referred to them as, quote, Puritans, because it was said that they wanted to, quote, purify the church. Over time, these petitioners actually took on that name Puritan, one that had been given to them by their adversaries, and began to wear it as a badge of honor because, in their words, that's exactly what they wanted to do, was to purify and make, in their mind, more scriptural the practices of the Church of England. There were two different types of Puritans with two different emphases. There were what you might call establishment or moderate Puritans who were content to work within the structures of the Church of England. They certainly wanted to change it. They believed it needed to be reformed, but they proposed to do so from the inside. The other group was known as separatist or separate Puritans. They were also sometimes called Puritans in a hurry. These Puritans believed that if their ideal church structure was prescribed by Scripture, then obedience required that they transform the Church of England immediately and not wait. And if the Church of England was not willing to be transformed, then they must break off and form their own churches. And so that's exactly what they began to do in the early 1580s. As long as you were a Puritan and remained within the Church of England, the state did not trouble itself about your activities. But if you stopped attending the services of the established church, you ran afoul of the law, and at that point you would be prosecuted. This did begin to occur in the late 1580s and early 1590s as separatists started to break off from the Church of England. Many of them were jailed, 3 of them were killed by hanging, and ultimately this led to many separatists fleeing the country, taking up residence in the Dutch Republic across the English Channel. The Dutch Republic, though it did have an official established Reformed church, was generally tolerant towards those of other religious viewpoints, as long as people were willing to contribute their economic stimulus and their social contribution to the overall atmosphere of the Dutch Republic. The Dutch generally didn't mind you holding diverse religious opinions. And so these English separatists found a ready home in the Dutch Republic. In 1603, Elizabeth died, and when she died, she was succeeded by the Scottish King James VI, who became James I of England. James was the son of Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, and since she had no heir, he was the next person in line to succeed to the throne. Many Puritans were excited at the prospect because James had been ruler of a Presbyterian country. Scotland had been officially Presbyterian for decades, and many of them hoped that James would prove to be an ally. They presented him with a petition upon his arrival called the Millenary Petition, presenting certain demands that they wanted him to allow them to have, certain demands they wanted him to concede to as he was becoming King of England. James convened a conference in 1604 called the Hampton Court Conference, where he sought to hear diverse opinions about this petition and its demands. He disappointed Puritans roundly at this conference, at one point declaring, "No bishop, no king," meaning that he did not intend to be the king of a state where there were no bishops and archbishops to lead the church. He, in fact, had come to despise Presbyterianism as King of Scotland and had been excited about the prospect of becoming king in a nation where Presbyterianism and strict Reformed theology did not have sway. The only one of the demands the Puritans had given that James agreed to was their demand that there be a new English translation of the Bible. In 1611, his counselors produced the King James Version. Even this ended up being a bait and switch, because even though he did translate all of the biblical books that Puritans approved of into English, they also translated the Apocrypha, which the Puritans objected to it being included in the canon of Scripture. And so ultimately, this also proved to be dissatisfactory to them. Many Puritans would continue using the Geneva Bible, which had been produced in the 16th century, long after the King James Version had been published. James increasingly began to prosecute gatherings of separatists. One such gathering was meeting in the north of England, led by a mild-mannered pastor named John Robinson. Another leader of the group was a man by the name of John Smith. They were meeting in a region called Scrooby in the north of England. Many members of the congregation were jailed, and as official persecution began to ramp up against this separatist church, they began to consider the possibility of relocating to Amsterdam. They finally took action in 1607 and early 1608. Sailing across the English Channel and taking up residence in the city of Amsterdam in the Dutch Republic. There was a church here called the Ancient Church, led by a pastor named Francis Johnson. I actually did my dissertation and subsequently published a book on this particular figure and his contribution to the separatist movement. John Smith, one of the leaders of this separatist church that had just relocated in 1608, had actually been one of Johnson's students at Cambridge University, and so they knew each other well. Unfortunately, they would not get along with each other well once the new congregation had moved and joined Johnson's ancient church. In fact, these people wouldn't remain in the ancient church. One group, led by John Smith and Thomas Helwys, a lawyer, broke off from the ancient church, and they became the root of the early Baptist movement, separating themselves from the ancient church. The other group, led by John Robinson, moved from Amsterdam to the Dutch city of Leiden. And their reason for leaving is because they simply didn't want to be part of the strife that roiled the ancient church. Of all the separatist movements, this group seems to have been the most mild-mannered and the least willing to engage in intramural battles, again, sort of taking after their pastor, John Robinson. These Leiden separatists from 1608 until 1619 lived in that vicinity in the city of Leiden and did so somewhat prosperously. In fact, all the accounts seem to indicate that they did quite well around Leiden. So why do some of them end up leaving later? One of the many myths about the Pilgrims is that they were immediately escaping a situation of religious persecution. Now, that was true to a degree. They had to leave England for that reason. However, once they arrived in the Dutch Republic, they were not being religiously persecuted, but they were living in a climate where they had to adapt to another culture. And over time, this began to disturb them, especially as many of them started to have children, and those children were growing up more immersed in Dutch culture than they were in English forms and customs. At one point, I asked one of my classes, after talking to them about this history, in the next session, why the Pilgrims left for North America. And one of my students said, well, it was because their kids were being Dutchified. At the time, I had no idea how many great opportunities I would have to use the term Dutchified in my later teaching career. It's a little bit of a made-up word, but it works pretty well. Their kids were being Dutchified. The English were disturbed that their sons and daughters were learning to wear wooden shoes, and that the form of Reformed instruction they were receiving was more Dutch than it was English. They wanted a place where they could have both religious toleration and also a place where they could establish their settlement based on the norms of English culture that they wanted to observe. And so to that end, by 1619, many of them began to discuss the possibility of immigrating to the English colony of Virginia. By late 1619, early 1620, they began to put plans in place to go. A group of them sailed from the Netherlands, from Leiden, back across the English Channel to London, where they could work with the Virginia Company to start planning for their journey to North America. Unfortunately, they had to leave many of the church members behind because they were either too elderly to travel or didn't have the means to go to North America. This included their pastor, John Robinson, who bade them a tearful farewell as they sailed from Leiden, saying, I believe that God has yet more light and more truth to reveal to you in that land to which you are going. For several months, they stayed in London and worked with the stockholders of the Virginia Company to plan their voyage. And in the fall of 1620, they began to embark. They loaded up on two ships. One of them was known as the Mayflower, and the other was known as the Speedwell. Among their number were prominent leaders whose names have become famous in the pantheons of American history. People like William Brewster, who was an elder member of the congregation and provided a lot of insightful leadership in the early days of the establishment of the Plymouth colony. And of course, William Bradford, a person who at that time was only about 30 years old and who was going to have a tremendous impact on the future of the Plymouth colony. These strangers and exiles, these pilgrims, were now going to be leaving a world with which they had become quite familiar over the past decade or so. The Dutch Republic was not home, but it had been a place of refuge for them for a while. And as Bradford was later going to say, as strangers and exiles, we now make our way across the Atlantic to an uncertain future. The ship that they took, the Mayflower, was not a very large ship. It was a merchant vessel. And it was, as we said, originally accompanied by a smaller vessel called the Speedwell to carry the excess members of the crew. There were in number 34 of the Separatist people who had originally been part of this congregation that settled in Leiden. But in addition to their numbers, we often forget there were also 66 persons who were known to the Pilgrims as, quote, strangers. Now, what is meant by that is they were not official members of the church covenant community. These were people that had been recruited in London and some places outside of London as well, who for various reasons were wanting to start over in the New World. And they also signed on to this pilgrim voyage. They didn't share necessarily the religious commitments of the primary core group, the 34 people who had made up the group of English Separatists that had first commissioned the voyage. That's worth remembering because there are going to be some conflicts that develop as the Plymouth colony is planted and as it comes to fruition between those who are there because of their theological motivations and those who are there for more earthly reasons. Well, not long after they embarked, they began to encounter serious problems. The Speedwell was absolutely unseaworthy. It sprang several leaks, and they end up having to put in the southeastern coastal town of Plymouth before they ever get out embarking across the Atlantic. And so it's for this reason that later on, the colony they establish is going to be known as Plymouth Colony, because this is the place where they had to regroup, resupply, and eventually load everyone, the entire 100 or so of their group, onto the Mayflower. And so it's the Mayflower alone that embarks across the Atlantic and undertakes this now legendary voyage in the early fall of 1620. The voyage is a horrific experience. Most of these people were not accustomed to being at sea. Remember, only about 34 of them were part of this separatist group that had traveled back and forth across the English Channel. And the English Channel is nothing compared to the tumultuous waters of the Atlantic Ocean, especially during a storm. And there were several of them as the Pilgrims made their way across the Atlantic Ocean. There was one documentary in particular that really brought home how horrible the voyage was for many, when it showed a scene of people below decks on the Mayflower struggling. And at one point, there's a pail that's sliding back and forth. And one person leans over and basically throws up into the pail, and then it slides back across the deck, and someone else grabs it, and they repeat this activity because they're so seasick and just absolutely unable to get their balance in the midst of all the tossing of the storm and the waves. This is a difficult voyage, a voyage that is beset by bad weather, a voyage in which they are afflicted by a variety of diseases. It is no small thing to make a transatlantic voyage during this period. There are so many risks involved, and one has to be very determined to do it, as were many of these people that came over to settle the earliest European colonies in North and South America. They finally arrive at what today is known as Cape Cod in early November 1620. And they're going to embark on a number of expeditions to explore the interior of this new land that they have discovered or on which they have landed. Now, once again, they had planned to travel to Virginia. That is where they had papers to land. That is where they had been guaranteed a space to farm. They were expected there. But because of the storms and because of some of the difficulties of navigation during that area, they end up in what today we know as New England. They're going to end up planting the first colonies, in fact, in New England. At first, they don't realize they're in a different spot. And this is one reason why they undertake these expeditions to explore the area. It doesn't take long, however, before they do figure out this is not Virginia. They have no idea how far they have come from Virginia, but they do know for sure this is not the tract of land that's owned by the Virginia Company. One of the complexities of that is that it means that all the agreements they had made in terms of adherence to the colonial government of Virginia are rendered moot because the government of colonial Virginia doesn't extend to the territory where they have landed. And so one of the early things they do is craft a document that today we know as the Mayflower Compact. Some of the strangers, the non-separatists among their company, insisted they do something like this because they wanted a governing charter. They wanted to know what the standards would be by which whatever colony they established would be governed. And so they did this. They drafted what is now known as the first document constructing a system of self-governance that was crafted in North America. Colonies in Virginia did have royal charters or company charters, but those had all been crafted in England. This is the first one crafted on American soil. They all signed this document, including prominent people like Bradford, Brewster. About 41 men of the company put their signatures to this document signed on November 11th, 1620. It's the first of many charters of government that would be authored in the new American colonies and the future United States as well. They sailed a little bit further on along the coast, and eventually they made landfall at the place that becomes the location of the Plymouth colony. The Plymouth colony is going to be established in late November, early December, 1620. This is the place today most often associated with the Pilgrims, and it's the beachhead for the growing European settlements that will soon fill this area and become a very disproportionate place in terms of shaping the future of American culture. The earliest governor of the Plymouth colony was a man by the name of John Carver, who led the colony through that very first desperate winter. This is a horrific time. It's a terrible time for them to arrive. Late November, early December, you're already beginning to get the first snowfalls. The weather is plummeting. They have to very quickly work to try to create shelter for themselves. Amidst all this, there are a number of tragedies. William Bradford's wife, Dorothy May, ends up throwing herself overboard, we think. Some say she fell overboard. Many historians today think that possibly she committed suicide by throwing herself overboard during this period. So Bradford is bereaved. Many people are already becoming ill of the sicknesses that will plague them throughout this first winter. By the time this first winter is done, half of their company will have succumbed to the cold or to various diseases. And that number is going to include the first governor, John Carver, who by February of that year himself falls ill. Well, by February of 1621, falls ill and ultimately dies. When he dies, young William Bradford is going to become governor of the colony. And in fact, he will remain governor from 1621 all the way until his final time serving as governor in 1656. There'll be some brief periods within that time period when he doesn't serve for a term or so, but he is reelected 30 times to serve in that post. And so he'll be the person most responsible for shaping the personality of Plymouth Plantation and the course of its growth throughout its first generation. Now, of course, very famously, these people would not have survived at all, none of them, had it not been for the connections they made with local Native American tribes. These Native American tribes themselves have been afflicted by disease, and many historians say that at the time that they had their first meetings with the Pilgrims in the spring of 1621, they themselves were in a somewhat weakened state. One of the first people the Pilgrims made contact with was a Native American named Squanto, who had actually been taken captive earlier in life, transferred across the Atlantic, and had actually been a slave to the English for a period before finally being able to return to North America and take refuge with another Native American group. Because of these experiences, Squanto was able to speak English, something very rare among Native American groups during this period. And so he's able to serve as a translator between the Pilgrims and other Native peoples in the area. And he does have at least some understanding of what English culture is like. The leader or sachem of the local Native tribes was a man by the name of Massasoit. And Squanto became an ambassador between leaders like Bradford and Massasoit. Massasoit's tribe was known as the Pocahontas, And they are part of a larger group of Native peoples called the Wampanoag, which is a mouthful. The Wampanoag are a confederacy of Native American peoples. Think the Iroquois, with which we're more familiar. The Iroquois have 5 nations that are a part of their confederacy of Native peoples. Well, the Wampanoag also are a large confederacy of Native peoples, and one of their subgroups is the Pecanoica tribe, which is led by Massasoit. They are the nearest neighbors to the Pilgrims, and they are the Native peoples who feature in a lot of these stories that are passed down to us of Native peoples helping the Pilgrims learn how to survive as they are coming out of that early first winter experience, which was so devastating to them. Squanto taught them how to grow corn or maize, which is one of the primary crops of the region, how to fish in the waters. Those cold Massachusetts waters are going to yield plentiful fish and all kinds of other materials to help them to survive. And so throughout this first winter and that first spring of 1621, the Native peoples are essential to the survival of the Pilgrims. Now, a lot of the stories you hear about these encounters are extremely idealized, and you do have to take them with a grain of salt. Squanto is a great hero in the sense that he does provide help for the Pilgrims, which they sorely need, but he also engages in some double dealing, trying to play them off against Massasoit, and at times attempting to stir up rivalry between the Pilgrims and the local Native tribes. At one point, Massasoit gets so angry at Squanto, he sends a message to the Pilgrims asking if they would not cut off his head and both of his hands and send them to Massasoit. The Pilgrims are reluctant to do that for a number of reasons. They communicate to Massasoit, we prefer not to engage in violence against Squanto. We'll talk to him and we'll try to get him to stop seeking to turn us against you, and vice versa. And so relations between the Pilgrims and the Native peoples were complicated. On the one hand, there was some mutual benefit and some exchange of ideas and assistance. On the other, there were tensions almost from the very beginning. Those tensions never quite go away. This alliance certainly is there, at least in the early 1620s, but we've got to remember it was a tense alliance at best as well. And some of the festivities that we hear about in which the Native peoples participated in, they were certainly opportunities to forge diplomatic ties between the two people groups, but they always engaged in these activities with an eye to the fact that there was always the possibility of one group betraying the other. And so these are tense alliances, and they will lead to a number of conflicts when they break down in the decades to come. The Pilgrim legacy. This is an interesting question, and one that many historians have delved deeply into in recent years. We, of course, know the Pilgrims most prominently as those that established the first Thanksgiving. This is complicated because while the Pilgrims observed a harvest festival in the fall of 1621 to give thanks for their survival during that first year, they didn't establish any sort of regular observance. In fact, it was not in their nature to do so. Reformed Protestants at this time, and the Pilgrims were typical of Reformed Protestant outlooks, were often very hesitant to establish holidays, what at that time were known as holy days. To them, holidays were a very Catholic affair, and they didn't want anything to do with Catholic precedents. And so they would have regular days for Thanksgiving, but those days were not mandated to happen at a certain time throughout the year because they very specifically wanted to avoid having anything that looked like Catholic holy days or holidays. And so when they had days of Thanksgiving, they were frequently simply called and not established on a regular basis or at a particular time of the year. In fact, the early Reformed Protestants in North America didn't even celebrate Christmas because they saw it as smacking of, quote, popery. It's only later that they began to return to a Christmas observance that's conditioned more after their own theological outlook. So it's important to remember this when we're talking about this idea of establishing a Thanksgiving. We know very little about what the first meal, which we now call a Thanksgiving meal, was like. We have, in fact, one reference to it in a letter sent by a pilgrim named Edward Winslow, who was a resident of the Plymouth colony and who sent this letter with a ship that showed up in November of 1621 in order to give news about the Plymouth colony to people back in England. So Winslow sent this letter. This letter consists of 115 words that describe a harvest festival held by the residents of the Plymouth colony in 1621. And I'm actually going to read you all 115 words. These are the only reference we have from the actual time period to this harvest festival that the Pilgrims held in the fall of 1621. Winslow wrote, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a more special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others." That's it. 115 words describing an event which we know very little about. There's no other reference outside of this one, and which has spawned one of the most significant celebrations in American culture, a celebration which still continues down to the present day. What we know about this event is that it was a harvest festival, that they did make it a time for commemoration of their hardships throughout the previous year and thanksgiving to God for preserving them throughout that period. We know that Native Americans were present, among them Massasoit, leader of the local tribe. There were about 99 of these men, and probably some women amongst them as well. In fact, the 99 may have included some women who came with the Braves also. We don't know that for sure, nor do we know the exact distribution of numbers, but that's probably a healthy assumption. They outnumbered, or would have outnumbered, the remaining pilgrims who would have been there. If we take the accounts at face value of the number of people who died the first year, there are probably only about 50 to 51 settlers left in the Plymouth colony. There may have been some that arrived in the fall that replenished their numbers a little bit, but it definitely wouldn't have been the 100 or 102 that first arrived when the Mayflower first docked. So they have a diminished population, and they are celebrating the survival of those who have been able to weather this horrific experience by fowling, hunting for possibly turkey, possibly other types of birds as well. Fishing, I would imagine that there's shellfish and other types of fish that they would feast on during the 3 days when they hosted this observance. And during this period, they're engaging in all kinds of fun activities. Maybe this is the precedent for football on Thanksgiving Day. And so that's what we get, this moment when these groups come together. We have no idea if there was a formal invitation issued to the native peoples or if they just showed up and became part of the festivities. It's unclear from Winslow's commentary. There are a couple of other documents that tell the history of Plymouth Plantation, included among them a collection of documents that was produced and published in 1623 called Mort's Relations, or Mort's Relation, as it became later known. And later on, towards the end of his life and career, William Bradford's going to publish a work called Of Plymouth Plantation, or On Plymouth Plantation, which tells the story from his perspective. And in it, he relates a number of the significant events that occurred during his time as governor of the colony. He does not, however, relate the story of this harvest festival that occurred in 1621. So again, we're primarily reliant upon Edward Winslow's commentary for the story of this event on which we base our later idea of Thanksgiving. So how did this become a regularly occurring thing? If the Pilgrims didn't make it a regular festival throughout the course of their experience in the 17th century, how did it become a regular tradition in American culture? Well, for that, we have to look to the 19th century, to a period when a lot of people in America are trying to recover some of the stories of our past. In 1841, there was a young minister who published a new edition of Mort's Relation to chronicle the story of the Pilgrim influence in New England. And as they did so, stories of Winslow's account of this harvest festival began to be circulated once more as well. And so throughout the 1840s, the 1850s, people sort of had a revival of interest in the early history of New England, and with it, this story of the harvest festival of 1621. There had been presidential proclamations asking for a day of prayer and fasting throughout American history since the beginning. George Washington had been the first president to call for some of these, and that practice had continued through most American presidencies. During the American Civil War, obviously, there was felt to be a very great need to engage in prayer and fasting and other such observances, and so they did. In 1863, in particular, President Abraham Lincoln called for a national day of prayer and fasting in November of that year. This ends up becoming a regular practice. Each year, there's a presidential proclamation calling for a day of Thanksgiving. Once Lincoln is assassinated, his successor, Andrew Johnson, continues the practice. And it continues throughout the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. Soon, Thanksgiving Day becomes an established custom, and many popular writers do tie the practice back to that original harvest festival that was observed by the residents of Plymouth Colony. Over time, it becomes an established fixture in American culture. Legally, it becomes a regular fixture during the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt wanted to establish Thanksgiving at a time that was ideal for merchants and other persons who are gearing up for the sales they hoped would take place during the Christmas season. This was especially important on the heels of the Great Depression. And so you can kind of see this in a way as part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal emphasis on trying to revive American commerce. In 1939, he issued a proclamation that Thanksgiving would be the fourth Thursday in November. He tweaked that a little bit in 1941, and from that point forward, it has continued to be celebrated the fourth Thursday in November, providing an opportunity for Americans to come aside and be thankful for the blessings of the previous year, to commemorate the things that they have both gained and lost during that period. And it also sets up framing for the commercial season that comes right before Christmas. And so in the 1930s and early 1940s, it becomes a regular practice, after having been customary for a long time, to occur at the same time, roughly, each year. And so that's how the Thanksgiving celebration became embedded in American culture. And over time, the story of the Pilgrims took on an even larger life as elements were added to it by both popular historians and also by people who are crafting historical fiction. It's become a routine rite of passage in American schools for kids to have Thanksgiving pageants, to dress up like Native Americans and also Pilgrims in their buckled black, and seek to recreate the atmosphere of that first celebration. There's a lot there that's probably not 100% accurate. For instance, the Pilgrims didn't always dress as dourly as they're portrayed as dressing. They often could dress in quite colorful clothes, in fact. And many of the portrayals of the Native Americans as well, they sometimes don't grasp the accuracy of their dress, mannerisms, or any of those sorts of things. So there is room for historians to quibble. But at the same time, there's a powerful American tradition that's been undergirded and supported by a lot of these holiday traditions that enriches us in many ways and does make us appreciate the early coming together of this nation, the early creation of the American colonies, and some of the important emphases that are going to end up shaping American culture in the years to come. And so to that degree, it's a very healthy thing in the sense that it does give us a touchstone, a common place to come together and sort of reflect upon the positive and the negative, and to celebrate those better parts of who we are and what we're doing. If you're interested in further discussion of these matters, there are a couple of things I'll recommend to you, or a couple of works that I could recommend for further reading. There are, of course, many of them out there. One of the best, I think, is a work by Robert Tracy McKenzie, who is a professor at Wheaton College in Illinois. It's called very simply The First Thanksgiving, and it talks about the real story of this first harvest festival held in 1621 and the implications of it for American culture in the century since then. And then I'm going to give you one shameless plug on my part. Like I said, I did my doctoral dissertation on issues relating to English separatism. And if you want to know more about the background from which the Pilgrims came and the foundations of some of their worldview that they brought to North America, then I encourage you to pick up a copy of my book, Francis Johnson and the English Separatist Influence, which talks about the world that helped shape the Pilgrims and help to shape the future of North America as well. Thank you for the time that we've shared together. I hope you've enjoyed it. And like I said at the beginning, I look forward to being face-to-face with you soon. I'll be back with you again in January when we talk about the very prolific writings and interesting career of one Thomas Paine. Have a great Christmas season. Have a great Thanksgiving. And I look forward to seeing you in January, if not before. Take care. Be safe and be well.